Welcome back. I told you at the end of that last little video, the last couple of minutes, that I was going to talk and just wrap up this business of the image of God in man. Human beings are really amazing creatures, males and females. You go all the way down to little kids, and it's just from that point on you begin to see the image of God reflected in humans individually, and then in culture at large. But does the image of God point to the infinite worth of human beings? I've heard people say that we are of infinite worth. Now that's not true, and I want to give you a little bit of an illustration to show what the image of God really points to in terms of glory and in terms of worth. Now suppose I showed you a photograph of my wife Connie. I've been married to Connie since 1976. She is the best thing that's ever happened to me. I really lucked out, and I love her with all my heart. I love you, Connie, if you watch this. Just wanted you to know. But if I took a picture of my dear wife Connie and I showed it to you, and you looked at that picture and you spit on that picture and you took it and ground it under your feet and you ripped it up into little pieces and you threw it back at me, what do you think would happen? I would be pretty upset, pretty hurt, and quite frankly a little bit angry. What does that point to? Does it point to the infinite worth of the piece of paper? No. It points to the value of the person whose image is reflected on that piece of paper. If it had been a picture of anybody else, I wouldn't be angry. But because that picture bears the image of my wife, Connie, it's an insult and an affront to me for you to treat that photograph that way. So you see, the image of God in human beings, in people, doesn't point to the infinite worth of the human being at all. In fact, the sum total of, our worth is not very much when you actually think about it in the physical context. We're mostly water and then a few other chemicals and substances, and that's pretty much it. So the image of God in man really points to the infinite worth of God, not man. So now let's move on. And again, if you see me looking down, I'm scrolling my notes up from my laptop. Okay, man is fallen. Man was created in this wonderful state, but the fall is created in Genesis chapter 3. The first couple, Adam and Eve, were presented with a test, as you know. It was just a single test. They were to eat of any fruit in the garden, but there was one fruit that they were prohibited from eating, and that was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And of course, as you know, they failed that one test. And because of that failure, and because of Adam's sin as the federal head and representative of the human race, he plunged the entire human race into sin. And so as a result, his posterity inherits from him a condition that we call inherited sin or original sin. So it's a condition that we inherit. Now, once they sinned, as you remember, they tried to hide from God. They felt ashamed and they ran off and they tried to hide. God came and found them and provided a covering for their nakedness. You know the story if you've read it. But so when that went down, spiritual death was the result. You remember that God said to Adam, in the day that you eat of the fruit of that tree, dying you will die, literally in Hebrew. You're going to most certainly die. But they didn't die physically, so that God must have meant something else. He meant spiritual death. Now I've explained what spiritual death is in a previous video, but if you haven't seen it, let me reiterate it. Even as physical death is the separation of the soul from the body, spiritual death is the separation of the soul from God. And we are born in a state of alienation from God. Every one of us is born going away from God. And it started with Adam and Eve with that first sin in the garden. And you know what? If you look at the Genesis story and you see that right after the fall, the incident of Cain and Abel was the first murder. Cain got jealous and was angry at his brother because God rejected his offering and accepted his brother's. And he hated him and he lured him out into the field and he killed him, struck him down and killed him. And from that point on, the whole rest of the Old Testament, in many ways, really, if you think about it, is a narrative of man's sin. I mean, you read the Old Testament, and one thing you learn, man, by the time you get to the end of the Old Testament, one thing is really clear. Man is a sinner. Man moves away from God. Well, what is that? Well, that starts out with an inherited condition. And Paul tells us in Romans 5:12, wherefore as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin. That's spiritual death. Of course, we're going to die physically too, which is a secondary effect. But the primary effect is death. And when we die without knowing Jesus Christ and having our sins covered by His blood, we experience what's called the second death, which is eternal separation from God. There's a first death, which is physical death. There's a second death, which is spiritual alienation from God. So the first death is this thing that Paul talks about when he says, death spread to all men for all sin. Spiritual death is an inherited condition, or original sin. So now the age-old question, is man a sinner because he sins, or does he sin because he is a sinner? Man is not born neutral. We aren't born with a clean slate, like a lot of your humanists and the ancient heretic Pelagius and many of your Arminians teach that we are born neutral. We have a clean slate, and when we sin, we become sinners. Actually, we sin because we are already sinners. Being a sinner is part of the human condition, but just remember something. The image of God is still intact in human beings, but it's marred, it's distorted, and it's corrupted. Clear over in the book of James, James talks about the tongue and how with it we bless God and we curse men who have been made in the likeness of God. So now it's talking about human beings that are created in the image of God after the fall. So it stands to reason that that image of God is still intact. People that don't know the Lord, people that aren't Christians, they're intelligent people many times. Being a Christian or non-Christian has nothing to do with being intelligent or unintelligent. It has to do with God reaching down and offering us a type of revelational knowledge and conviction that's not accessible through normal means. So it has nothing to do with being smart or dumb. There are, like I've said before, there are smart non-Christians and there are dumb Christians and there are dumb non-Christians and some pretty smart Christians. That's not the issue. But so the image of God is still there, but it is marred. Human beings still possess some capacity for spiritual consciousness, moral and ethical reasoning, as well as creative ability and appreciation for beauty. But this ability is skewed, it's haywire because of sin. And again, we can look out across the human beings can still appreciate beauty. They can look at a sunset and say, oh, that's such a beautiful sunset, that's a beautiful tree. But because of sin, the way they see it isn't, oh, that's a beautiful tree God created. It's a beautiful, not created by God tree. It's still beautiful, but it is seen out of context. And I think that's what we're going to get into next when we talk about the results of the fall, and a two-bit term that the theologians call the doctrine of total depravity or total inability.